What's the church's role in spending money to help the needy?
Let's put that to the test.
This is Prove All Things, a podcast where we test everything so that we can hold fast to what is good and abstain from what is evil.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. I want to kind of start by just reminding our listeners what our goal is in this podcast. We're just trying to discover what the will of God is, and we're using the Bible to do that. That's the only way that we'll know what it is that God wants from us as individuals and as we operate as local churches. And that's all we know to do, is to just find in the Bible what the will of God is, and we'll either find that by something that's been said directly or some example that we can draw an inference from. And so using that as a basis, we want to talk about specific things, and today we want to use our time to talk about churches and their money, and specifically, what is the church's role in helping the needy? And that's a big subject in the New Testament. As a matter of fact, as soon as we see the church begin in Acts chapter 2, one of the most immediate needs was a financial need. So how do we go through the Bible and determine from the Bible what the church's use of, or how churches use their money to help those who are needy?
Yeah, I think in the previous podcast, the passage that we went to look at the authority that we have for a congregation to even collect funds together was based upon the need of Christians. I think we looked at 1 Corinthians chapter 16 in verse 1, where it says, "Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given orders to the churches in Galatia, so you must do also. On the first day of the week, let each one of you lay something aside, storing up as he may prosper, that there be no collections when I come." And that was in the context of Christians in another area in Judea being in financial need. And so here the churches in Corinth and also mentions the churches in Galatia were given these orders as well to collect money and send it to meet the needs of those. So I would say first and foremost, we look and we see examples of congregations using their money to help needy Christians.
Yeah, that's the pattern that we see beginning all the way back in Acts chapter 2. So you have all those who had come from all over the world, who had obeyed the gospel when they made it to Jerusalem, and that created somewhat of a crisis where you have people who have left their homes, left their livelihood, left their possessions behind, and now they're staying in Jerusalem, no doubt to take advantage of the fact that that's where the apostles are and to take advantage of the spiritual nourishment that they're getting there. But it creates a need because eventually their personal money runs out. And so you see, beginning in Acts chapter 2, that they are distributing funds to those believers. In Acts 4, they're selling land. In Acts 2, I think they're selling possessions. Acts 4, they're selling land. Acts 6, it looks like there's a daily ministration of this, that there's a daily serving. And all of that is focused on the believers there in Jerusalem. And so as you go through those texts, you'll see that sometimes it talks about all those who were there or everyone had their needs met. But then you see other things that indicate that all is limited to the believers that are working together.
So in that case, you've got, I would say, we could say nearly thousands perhaps, that are displaced from their homes or are not with their homes, without the jobs that they were supporting themselves with. So really unusual circumstances
right
there, and you see the other Christians, you see the church in Jerusalem responding to meet that, to help in that situation.
And so that speaks to the kind of help that we're talking about is meeting the needs of people. And that idea of needs maybe is something that needs to be addressed.
Well, I think we were discussing before the show that the idea of needy could be somewhat subjective, from culture to culture, from place to place, maybe even from church to church. That that's why you have, I guess, maybe qualified men, in positions thinking about this work and looking over this work, like elders and deacons. And as you look at what a need may be in Africa, well, it may be a little bit different in America. It may even require a little bit more money to maintain the basic standard of living. And the reason maybe that we need to think about needy is because there are some scriptural limitations on how the church uses its money to help needy people. One of those, I think, has already been discussed. The idea that the churches only use their money to help Christians. And We just see that over and over. 1 Corinthians 16 is one example, but as Paul continues talking to the Corinthians about this gift, in chapter 8, he talks about the idea of, in verse 4, ministering to the saints. He's still talking about money being collected for the saints. In chapter 9, he talks again, verse 1, ministering to the saints. In Romans 15, when Paul talked about this gift that he was on his way to present to the needy saints in Jerusalem, he says, I am going to minister to the saints. So it is evident that in Paul's mind, as he's writing to the churches, that's one of the limitations. So why would we even look at a person in need and think have any question about whether or not we help them? Well, we're trying to respect what we see. That's one limitation that so far as what the church did. The church used its money to help needy Christians.
Yeah, when we put those 9 passages, if we've counted correctly, there's about 9 passages that talk about the church helping needy people. And in every one of those, when we're talking about a local church using their funds to help needy people, it is specified that they're helping needy saints. Now, it's interesting to me that it doesn't just leave it kind of vague so that we wonder, but that in all 9, it specifies this is for needy Christians. And so we may mention that in the first situation, you've got an extenuating circumstance with these people who are from all over the world, who now are in a peculiar setting. But then in chapter 11, it starts a collection that's during the context of a famine that's in Judea and Jerusalem. And so from chapter 11, the passages we've mentioned in Romans 15, 1 Corinthians 16, 2 Corinthians 8 and 9 are all with this emergency in view. And that doesn't mean that that's the only time when a church could help needy people is in a like a natural disaster. But it does show us that what's being met here is not maybe some of the niceties or the luxuries of life, but in meeting whatever we're thinking of as basic daily standard of living kind of thing.
Yeah, and it seemed like that this was intended to be temporary too, to help saints overcome whatever the current circumstances are, the current disaster or hardship, and kind of get them back on their feet, where then they can continue to. Because I think the Bible's clear that we have a personal responsibility in supporting our needs and our family and so forth. And so these were circumstances beyond that. And you see the church helping and stepping in on this occasion, but it didn't appear that this was to be something that was permanent. It was to be something that meet these current crises.
So even within the limitations, there are limitations. If we're just looking at the examples that we have, we first of all, we established that the scriptural limitation is the church helping those who are members of the church. But even within the church members, there are some limitations. Tad, I think you had mentioned some of the scriptural limitations we have for even those who are inside the church.
Yeah, if anyone will not work, neither shall he eat. That's 2 Thessalonians 3 and verse 10. So, the church is looking at a person's situation and they feel like, and that would be a tough discussion to have, but they feel like, that you're not doing enough to try to provide for yourself. It's hard for us to conscientiously, because Paul said, if you won't work, then you don't have a right to eat. And so another discussion we may have to have is maybe someone's trying to maintain a really luxurious lifestyle. Well, that's not what this is about. Maintaining a high lifestyle, this is about people who don't have what they need on a daily basis.
Well, I think also in that same passage, maybe what he's warning against is people becoming dependent on the church as their sole source of income. And I believe what the warning is that there is a need, and the church wants to be able to meet that need, but it was never the intention of God for the church to meet that need on an ongoing basis, except for maybe in some other circumstances where that need is always going to exist. But I think it is worthy to be noted that it's not meant to always be something that somebody in the church, even someone in the church, relies on.
So if we're looking at the Scripture, the picture that we get of the church is not an organization that is set up to take care of worldwide benevolence. It's not just looking and saying, okay, well, there are poor people out there. We need to help those poor people. And I think that sometimes because helping the poor is a good work, that sometimes people naturally assume that the Lord's church, what the Lord intended for his church to do was to do that. But what we see from these scriptures is that was not the primary intention that the Lord had for the Lord's church. He did have in mind that the church would help those who were Christians in that. That's the scripture that we see. And then even in that, there were limits in that for certain period of time in certain circumstances.
Yeah, I think that idea that the church's role is not to help needy people generally is surprising sometimes to people. They think, well, that's exactly what churches are for, but that's not what churches are for. They have a mission that they've been given, and that mission is defined, as we've said over and over, it's defined by what God says their mission is, and that's in preaching the gospel and then in helping needy saints is what we see here. And I think maybe the question arises, well, if the church doesn't help them, does that mean that they're just not going to be helped? Well, of course not. Individual Christians have a responsibility to do what they can to help. Galatians 6:10 would be a passage, I think, that would say, as we therefore have opportunity, let us do good to all men, especially those of the household of faith. And I think if you look at the context of that, he's addressing individual Christians who are part of those churches. But every time we say the collective use of the funds, it's used to help needy saints. And so it's not that they go unhelped. It's just that's not what the collective responsibility is.
Yeah, 1 Timothy chapter 5, I think, gives us a situation where it's addressing helping needy saints. It's talking about helping widows. Widows in ancient times really had a tough situation because the primary wage earner of the family's gone, and they don't have the support and help that they need. So can the church step in to help those who are widows, who are Christians, who are part of the church? And the answer was, well, yes, they can. But even in that, there was limitations there, that they were not to just help them on an indefinite basis. There were some that they were to do that with, and I think the King James says widows indeed. Those who are true widows, and then qualifications are given, age limits given there, a character profile is kind of given there of what type of people that they are. Those could be enrolled permanently in a role, it seems, for the church to take care of. But it says younger widows. Don't let the church be burdened with them. And it makes the point in verse 16 of chapter 5. If any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them, and do not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are really widows. So it does two things here. It shows a distinction between the responsibility of the individual and the responsibility of the church. There are things that the individual has a responsibility and that the church is not to be burdened with. And then there are also you see that the role of the church is not to be overcome by this benevolence. And I think that's important when we're talking about people who have the concept, well, the church should be a relief organization for the whole world. Well, there's no way the church could do the work that the Lord intended for it to do if it took on that type of burden. And so I think it's important to see that the Scriptures show us the limitations on that.
Yeah, that's why I think 1 Timothy 5 should really at least begin to shape our thinking on the use of church money, because what it definitely does is it takes a situation that almost everybody would look at and say, if there's anybody that's in need of being helped by the church, it's this poor widow. But even with that, there are limitations, which opens up our eyes to the fact that it's not the intention of the church just to help any and every need. And so if there's a limitation here, what that maybe opens our eyes up is, all right, I need to be looking through all the New Testament to see if are there other limitations. And certainly I think that's what we're bearing out in this discussion, that if we follow the pattern that we have in the New Testament, we understand that there are a lot of limitations.
And it's not that we're saying that a church should stop doing benevolent work so that it can focus on evangelism. I think the first example we have where there was a conflict in Acts chapter 6, they made it so that both could continue. That's what the problem was, that maybe the apostles were being overwhelmed by the benevolent work, and so these men were appointed. That work continued. It didn't stop, so the apostles could continue to focus. You know, churches, if they are supported by what they give and collect, together as a local church, then eventually you're going to reach a point where you're out of money. You're doing all that you can do, and the only way to do more would be if someone could give more money, give more time, but you kind of reach a point where each church is limited with its resources. They've reached max capacity, and at that point you're trying to maybe grow so that you can do more. but you're eventually going to run out of money, and you're going to be doing all the benevolence and all the teaching that you can do.
Yeah, every organization has to make decisions about exactly how their money is going to be spent. No matter what their mission is, they're going to have to prioritize certain, whether you're talking about cancer research or something, you're going to have to prioritize where this money is going to go. As Christians, the New Testament forms the basis of how we prioritize those things. And so we don't just make those decisions based on what we think would be good or what we think should be the priority, but and that doesn't mean that we don't have to make judgments within that, but our foundation for that is we've got a charter for our organization, so to speak, and that's the New Testament and the examples that we have given through the apostles and that sort of thing. And so that shapes our priority in that, or at least it ought to.
I think it's maybe shocking. 1 Timothy 5:16 is shocking from the standpoint of maybe in our culture, I don't know how it is in other cultures, there's a lot of different cultures, but maybe in our culture, very rarely are we thinking that now the family is going to be the first to pick up the slack of a person who has need. Usually it's some charity, maybe it's the government, and a lot of times maybe it's the church. They're expecting these groups to pick up the slack. But if we're going to follow God's pattern, if there is someone who is close to us, who is in need, who is a family member, then we ought to look at ourselves and say, I have a responsibility to help them to the extent that I can.
Good point.
Yeah. All right. Well, that just about exhausts all the time that we have in this particular discussion. But if perhaps we have said something today that that maybe you disagree with, I think we probably have said some things that might not be the normal thinking for some people. And Larson, I think you mentioned that maybe some of the things that we're saying are actually kind of shocking. What do you mean that the church can't use its money for this? But let me remind you that we're just trying to follow what the will of God is. And again, the only way that we know what the will of God is if it's been revealed to us in the Bible in some way. And so if we just take it upon ourselves to start acting where we don't have some level of authority, then I think we're in dangerous territory. So if you have questions that you would like for us to answer about this particular subject, we invite you to reach out to us. You can find us on Facebook, or you can reach us via email at proveallthings@mail.com. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening to Prove All Things. To suggest a topic, raise a question, or offer a comment, write to proveallthings@mail.com.